In Colorado, we have some of the most beautiful scenery in the world, and we have a tendency on the weekends to run out to the mountains and get into nature and immerse ourselves as a way to escape from the artificial, sterile environments of our work world. And we have this division between the world of our work and the world of our leisure. Yet man is part of nature, and the things that we do as human beings, especially when you consider our group behaviors, kind of bears that out in ways that have really interesting implications for the future of work in our society. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the kinds of patterns that occur in our modern workplace and social systems and what they mean and maybe what you can do about that to try and leave the world a little better for future generations. The blinding flash of the obvious, to use my friend Suzanne Tullien's term, came when I realized that organization charts for companies, for government entities, for nonprofits tend to be tree diagrams. So while there are other organizational structures certainly, and we can intentionally design organizations that are a little flatter in structure, we do tend to migrate toward those tree diagrams when left to our own devices. Just the way a group of people will organize themselves to accomplish a task or simply to tell jokes around the water cooler. Man is part of nature. Even when we try to control the flow of information within a social system, an organization, we can't help but mimic nature, and that's how we end up with these tree diagrams. Well, that big aha got me thinking about patterns in group behaviors and what those might look like and what those might mean. And I ended up for my doctoral dissertation looking for fractal patterns in the behavior of a social system and finding that in the stories people tell. When you talk to a group of people that are part of the same social system, you can find certain kinds of behaviors that repeat in small ways and big ways that sort of characterize the system that they're a part of. They tell you the nature of the group and what it's likely to continue to behave like in the future. That's pretty powerful stuff. So let's talk about fractals just a little bit. The term fractal was coined by Benoit Mandelbrot when he was working for IBM back in the 1980s and looking for mathematical ways to approximate geometric forms in nature so that you weren't just using a triangle to represent a mountain, as he famously pointed out. So without going into the mathematics of fractals and computer simulation, let's just talk in very simple terms. Fractals in nature are patterns that repeat on multiple scales, and it's called self-similar repetition because it's not exactly the same every time, but it's pretty close. And I'll give you my favorite example because I think this is a very clear way to explain it. If you think about the ways that on a leaf, the ways that the veins come off of the sides of that central vein in a leaf, and then you zoom out and you look at how the leaves on that same tree came off of the twig that they were on. And you zoom out again and you look at how the twigs come off of the branches on the same tree. And you zoom out again and look at how the branches came off of the trunk. You know something about what kind of tree it is. And you can probably guess what the next leaf is going to look like because you're seeing the same kinds of patterns repeating on multiple scales. And that's an example of a fractal in nature. And we see this in all kinds of settings, the way that avalanches behave, sand piles, the Dow Jones Industrial Average. We even see these kinds of scalable self-similar patterns in music, in fugues. Just fascinating stuff. So groups of people, when they organize themselves, will do these kinds of things as well because we are part of nature. We do live on this planet. So when you take that understanding and you consider it in the modern world of work and the way that things are going into future generations as technology advances, it has some pretty interesting implications. With globalism, the internet, air travel, we're finding that there's expert information available to everyone who can read. And guess what? That's an increasingly large amount of the world as literacy rates soar. And we're dealing with multicultural environments and a lot of diversity, and air travel takes us to the point where we're we're competing and creating with people who are very different from those we grew up with. So we've got this tightly coupled system, this interconnected world, where something happening on the other side of the world is now of importance to me here in the States, because it's like if you pull a drum skin really tight and then you tap one end of it, the vibration comes throughout the whole drum head, even the far end. And now our social systems are becoming like that, where everything is so interconnected that a small effect in one place can have huge effects elsewhere and begin cascading change. So that's all very interesting and important, because we're moving into a world where the only constant is change. And that's a little scary for those of us who grew up thinking of an organization as everything that fits in a box on a sheet of paper that's my organization chart, and where I have a span of control. Because control's kind of an illusion now. Information flows in and out of every organization, whether we like it or not. So the trick is to begin to spot those patterns of behavior in your organization and in your marketplace and among your competitors and in the system at large, so that you can kind of know what's going on and what's likely to keep happening within any social system. Not so different from looking at that plant and having an idea of what the next leaf will probably look like. You can do those sorts of things with social systems. Of course, human beings are very unpredictable, and one change can have unpredictable effects elsewhere, but there are patterns that are likely to repeat within social systems, and they're not just social patterns, they're social and material patterns, what we call socio-material patterns that unfold. And when you think of the social and the material being bound together like that, some people have a hard time with that. We tend to think in terms of material things being very separate from the touchy-feely, squishy, emotional things. But think about a couple of examples. Think about how boardrooms of major corporations are designed using material elements to create a feeling of power and prestige. Think about how real estate is sold through staging that includes comfortable furnishings and the smell of chocolate chip cookies in the oven, so that you can, on a very deep social level, imagine yourself living there. So that's what I'm talking about. The social and the material influence each other, and the patterns I'm talking about are both. Absolutely both. So let's think about that. This world is very different from past generations. You know, my grandfather dealt with the social and the material very differently. He was the plumber in a small town in Virginia. And certainly he dealt with the social and the material at the same time, making friends while he was fixing a sink or building up relationships with his customers. But his world was a lot less complex than what we have today. You know, there was no internet then. And expert information, how to fix your own sink, was less available to his customers than what we have today. And he had a predictable set of problems he was likely to encounter, a specific set of tools and supplies that were more than likely going to be sufficient for everything he might encounter, and perhaps a little less competition, and certainly a less socially diverse clientele than what we see today, now that we've had all of this. The melting pot has grown so much with our ability to travel the world over. So it's a very different world than what he lived in. And so we need some different tools. And so instead of thinking about specific things and just training ourselves in how to solve specific problems, we now need to understand those values, the beliefs, the cultural underpinnings of the patterns in society and in the marketplace and in our organizations, so that we can adapt better as the context changes and work with patterns that are likely to recur. Interesting stuff. So all of this is grounded in a whole lot of really interesting organization development research over many, many years. We've had some great breakthroughs. We had living systems theory. We've had socio-technical systems theory, which came out of the Tavistock Institute in the 1960s. We've got complex adaptive systems and the body of theory surrounding that, and the work of Glenda Ouyang and her cohort. All kinds of interesting things coming right up to the present, where we have quantum storytelling theory, which teaches us to look for the patterns in these complex systems that are at once co-creative, social, and material. So it all gets very complicated and very complex. I want to explain the difference between a complicated system and a complex system so that you can better understand what we're talking about in terms of the fluidity and the growth and how these patterns bubble up. If you think about complicated systems, an automobile is a nice example. A car is a very complicated system. There are many moving parts and computers and all sorts of pieces that have been carefully engineered to fit together with precision and to operate a certain way over the long haul. But there's not growth and learning going on in that system. Once a car is manufactured, its design is static. That's not changing over time. Presumably in 10 years, apart from wear and tear, my automobile should drive the same way it does today. The gears will still fit together the same way. The engine will still work the same way. But when we think about living systems, which is increasingly the model that applies to our organizations and our social networks, it's a very different thing, because groups of people learn and they adapt and they change and they create new patterns of socio-materiality over time. And these patterns continue to perpetuate in many cases because they're part of the organizational culture or because they become habits. And so then we have to think about the patterns that we see in the marketplace and in our organizations and even in our families in terms of what they mean for the long haul, for sustainability. And think about, I see this pattern, this keeps happening again and again. I knew that was going to happen. Is this good for my business? Is this good for my family? Is this good for society at large? What does this pattern mean for future generations if it continues? And you can put this logic to work in all sorts of different settings, from environmental concerns to technological development, all kinds of interesting things. But ask yourself about the patterns you see and how you feel about those continuing and perhaps occurring on really big scales. And then once you've decided that there's something that you would like to be involved in trying to change or influence or perhaps start a new pattern, then you've got a lot of choices at your disposal. And generally the things that blend the social and the material in ways that create new habits are things that tend to stick. Aristotle talks about ethics in terms of habits, how our values and our belief systems kind of shape our habits, and at the same time the habits we choose to develop affect our value systems and our ethics as human beings. Same kind of thing for social patterns, and I love to use yoga as an example of this because dating back to 300 CE, it's been a system for transformational change that is social and material at the same time. When we choose to practice, it changes our belief systems and how we see the world and calms us down. And because of our values and what we think is important, we'll choose to practice and to behave in certain ways toward other people. And all of that can be very generative. And I'm not saying that yoga is the only way to shift and create new patterns. It's one of many ways. People are experimenting with equine therapy, sand play, certainly from psychology into organization development. A lot of different ways to do this. But my challenge to you is to see if you can think of our modern world and our future of our organizations in terms of fractal-like patterns, the things that are likely to repeat on big scales and small scales, and make good, responsible decisions about the patterns that you are a part of or that you interact with. See if we can't leave the planet better for future generations by creating some positive patterns that maybe will ripple throughout that pond in ways that make the world a better place. Thank you.